Wir haben zunächst einmal eine Sprecherin, die ich schon ganz lange kannte, über den Namen, aber jetzt mal persönlich kennenlernen. Das ist Annie Machon. Sie ist die Direktorin von einem Netzwerk, das heißt Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Und sie wird uns gleich natürlich da mehr darüber erzählen. Also die erstaunliche Sache, dass sich Menschen aus der Strafverfolgung zusammenschließen, weil sie sagen, unsere Polizeiarbeit, unsere Justiz unter diesen Bedingungen des Drogenverbots oder selektiven Drogenverbots und der Repression, der ultimativen Durchsetzung, da wird unsere Arbeit erschwert bis unmöglich gemacht. Also das, was wir Sozialarbeiter ja eigentlich auch sagen, dass wir erst ganz am Ende zur originären Suchthilfearbeit kommen. Und das wird Annie Machon feststellen dann für die Polizeiarbeit. Ja gut, sie wird in Englisch sprechen. Jetzt kann ich ja sagen, der geheime Plan dieser Veranstaltung ist ja eigentlich ein Englischkurs. Das hatte ich ehrlich gestern Morgen sagen können, aber tut mir leid, jetzt erst, ich bin abgeschreckt gewesen und wäre nicht so lange dabei geblieben. Aber ich denke, es wird wieder ein sehr nachvollziehbar, und Sie haben ja begeistert auch die Hände hochgenommen. Insofern kann man davon ausgehen, dass alle alles verstehen, und das ist auch wunderbar so. Please, Annie, it's your turn. 10 Minuten, Viertelstunde, dann habt ihr Zeit für Nachfragen, dann gehen wir zu unserem nächsten Gast über, und auch da werden wir Zeit haben, nach dem Vortrag ein paar Nachfragen zu machen, und dann kommen wir da. Please.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I found what I could understand of this conference fascinating and very heartening that so many new initiatives are coming forward to try and at least decriminalise and reduce the harm of drug use. What I want to do now is take about 15 minutes to talk about the next logical step in the debate, which is legalisation, regulation, control and taxation. My name's Annie Machon. I started my working life as an intelligence officer with the British Security Service, otherwise known as MI5, before resigning to blow the whistle, as we did in Edward Snowden many, many years ago. I continue to speak out about a number of issues I feel passionately about, and of course, the war on drugs is one of those subjects. It is such a no-brainer. It's a lost war, and prohibition is one of the biggest failures over the last 100 years of global politics. So in that capacity, I joined LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, 4 years ago, and I've been the European Director for the last year and a half, trying to build up a LEAP network across Europe. LEAP actually started in America 11 years ago, only 11 years ago, and yet in that time it has grown to have over 100,000 supporters and representation in 120 countries around the world. And this was from 5 police officers getting together and setting it up in 2001 too. So it's grown exponentially, and it's not just police officers involved in this, it's also former spies, customs officers, judges, lawyers, prison governors, and even the odd drug czar. And we came together because we all understand from our professional background the sheer folly, the sheer failure of prohibition. And as America is really the fountainhead of the UN conventions that brought about the war on drugs, I just want to run through a few indicators of how appallingly it has failed in that country, and then pull out and look at the global situation, not just for our consumer countries, but the way that the war on drugs has ravaged the entire planet. So, in America, there will be 7 indicators about whether the war on drugs is being won, whether we are moving towards a drug-free world, which of course is the aim of the war on drugs. Well, you all know, of course, that we're not. But the key indicators would be that supply decreases. And yet in America, since the war on drugs started, seizures have rocketed from kilos to tons. The purity would decrease if we were winning the war, but in fact it's gone up exponentially. The average seizure of heroin now in the US has gone from a purity of 1.5% 40 years ago to 60% now. Prices, of course, would increase as drugs became scarcer. Again, we're not seeing that in America. Wholesale decreases have gone on across the drug spectrum, most notably with cocaine, which has decreased in cost wholesale by 60%, and heroin by 70%. And of course we would see that use would decrease. Well, America, we certainly know, has not seen a decrease in usage. What we're looking at now is 40 years ago, 4 million people were using drugs. That was 2% of the population. Now we're looking at 121 million people, which is almost half the population. Point number 5 is overdose deaths would decrease because drug usage would go down. Again, over the last 40 years, we've seen the figure rise from 1 in 100,000 people dying from a drug overdose to 10 in 100,000 people dying of an overdose. It's going up. Violence and murder would decrease. Well, again, we haven't seen that on the streets of the US. The deaths of police officers have increased exponentially, as have gang warfare and gun violence on the streets. And finally, the arrests would decrease. Unfortunately not. In 1965, drug arrests totaled 65,000 people in a year. Fast forward 40 years, that went up to 1.9 million in 1 year for drug possession, usually. So we've seen 46 million people in the US have been arrested and mainly incarcerated in this war on drugs. So by any metric, this is a complete failure. And that's just one country. Of course, it is the key consumer country, and it's the biggest market for the illegal drug trade. And it's estimated, I think by the UN, the annual drug trade is worth between 300 billion and 500 billion, $500 billion per year. And all that money, because of prohibition, is flowing not only into the pockets of organised crime cartels, it's also flowing and funding most of the terrorist organisations in this world. The DEA, even the DEA, conservatively reckons that well over half, the terrorist organisations currently deemed to be terrorist get most of their funding from the illegal drug trade. So think about this. I mean, how illogical can we get? When we have prohibition, we fight the war on drugs, it sends the trade underground, creates the biggest global crime wave we've ever seen, and then that money is used to fund the terrorists, and then we're waging a war against terrorism. You can see the circular argument. Someone somewhere is making a lot of money, and of course we know that a lot of that money flows through our banking system as well. I think there was a very famous quote after the 2008 financial crash, where the head of Unidoc said that the only reason that most global banks had any form of liquidity was because of the grey money and the black money coming from the drug trade. It's crazy. And even when banks get caught out, as our British bank HSBC was a couple of years ago, for money laundering from the Mexican drug cartels, they received a fine, sure, £1.9 billion. But that is a drop in the ocean in the scale of profits they are making off this illegal drug trade. So just to give you a feel for the amount of money that's also going to our terrorist enemies, for example, in Afghanistan, which, as you know, produces about 90% of the opium poppy trade, there, the acreage under growth has trebled in some areas since we went into imposed democracy on the country. And the trade from that brings in about between $500 and $700 million per year, most, if not all, of which is under the control of the Taliban and the terrorist warlords. That buys a lot of Kalashnikovs. And other countries too. I mean, Colombia is infamous because they've been fighting a terrorist insurgency for 40 years. It's called FARC. And they gain about $300 million per year from the cocaine trade. So this is a crazy situation in the producer countries too. And then, of course, you have to look at what's happening in the transit countries globally. And particularly the meltdown going on across Western Africa over the last few years, which is the new big route from Latin America into Europe. And here we've seen state after state descend into narco-terrorism. Mali, Guinea-Bissau, and now, of course, the newly gratefully liberated Libya. We have a situation there now where it is under the control of competing terrorist militia groups. And the drug transit trade has exponentially grown in the last 2 years. On top of that, the poor Libyans have seen an exponential growth in drug use within Libya too. And that has resulted in rocketing AIDS figures as well. So every which way you look at this, globally, it's a mess. Not just for our consumer countries, we are the lucky ones, but for the producer and the transit countries too. And this is the situation we've created purely by prohibition, by driving this trade underground. And how can we not learn after 40 years of the drug war that by hoping that doing the same thing again and again and again will bring about a different outcome? That is Einstein's definition of insanity. And that's what we seem to have at the moment, is a case of global insanity. Now, of course, there are some good things happening around the world, not only in America itself, with the 2 states fully legalizing the use of cannabis, but of course we've heard about many successful harm reduction initiatives across Europe. And also in Latin America, many countries now are saying, we want to rethink, we want to change the UN drug conventions. They are causing too much violence and harm and damage to our societies. So this is why LEAP advocates looking at the next step in the drug debate. Harm reduction is wonderful. It protects the users. It does not criminalise them. It gives them help if they need it. But the next logical step has surely got to be, how do we deal with this awful profit motive that has created this global crime wave? And only by getting rid of that profit motive will we get rid of the drug cartels, the funding going to terrorism, the destabilising of whole regions and countries. And that's what LEAP advocates. And I would suggest that we add a unique voice to the drug debate, because we're not out there saying, well, some of us might be, some of us aren't, we're not out there saying, we want to legalise cannabis so we can smoke a joint. We are saying from our professional background, our experience, we know that the drug war has failed, and it's causing global harm as well as community level harm. So that's what we're advocating. We're in the process, as I said, trying to set up a LEAP network more formally across Europe. So if you know any law enforcers, serving or retired, judges, lawyers, prison governors, whomever, who might be interested in helping with this and helping to speak out about this, please do put them in contact with me. I'll put a bunch of my business cards on the desk over there, so anyone who's interested in following up any of this stuff, please do drop me an email. I think the final point as well is the financial side. Not of taking the money out of the hands of the criminals, but actually, think about it, if we can control and regulate and crucially tax this market, that would solve a lot of our austerity problems. How many countries cannot afford to think about at least doing this and raising tax revenue, which they can then plough back into helping people who develop problems? We have a situation in the UK where a report was commissioned looking at what the Treasury revenues, what would happen to the Treasury revenues if just cannabis were legalised in the UK today, just one drug. And that report estimated that we could have an increase in revenue of about £1.6 billion per year. And this would come mainly from taxation, 1.2 billion, but also from law enforcement, which would be 170 million, from the judicial process, 155 million, and from, of course, the incarceration process, the prison system, 135 million. Now, Britain is financially bankrupt. How can we afford not to have this debate? And I would suggest that many European countries are facing the same challenges. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and please, if anyone can help, support, or wants to pull together some LEAP groups or anything like that, or has events that we can add our unique and unusual law enforcement voice to, we're very happy to help. Thank you very much.
Energetisch wunderbar auf den Punkt gebracht. Gibt es Fragen an Machon? Ja? Achso. Können auf Deutsch oder auch Französisch gestellt werden, weil sie hat auch französischen Ursprung. Nee, bitte in Deutsch. Oh, Deutsch auch.
Wir übersetzen.
Kidding.
Möchte jemand?
Gut. Also, wir wissen jetzt, und die Visitenkarte wird da liegen, was LEAP ist, was LEAP will, und dass wir eine MI5-Agentin mal auf der Bühne haben, hätte ich mir auch nicht träumen lassen. Aber wunderbar, also enchanté. Und sehr schön auch den Bogen, den sie geschlagen hat zur Förderung des Terrorismus, die Irrationalität und eben auch die Failing States in Westafrika. Das ist, glaube ich, das sind Entwicklungen, geopolitische Entwicklungen, die unbedingt genannt gehören, wenn wir über Regulierung und Irrationalität des Gesamten sprechen und eben die Erodierung der demokratischen, rechtlichen, finanziellen, auch ökologischen Prozesse in den Herstellerländern, in den Transitländern in den meisten und eben zum Teil auch in den Produzentenländern. Ja gut, vielen Dank, Annie.